Thank you for joining us from across the pond. Some of you in the US and some of you in the UK, who knows, maybe some people somewhere else even, I don't know, to talk about teaching Britannia. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully that will move smoothly. There we go. And then I'll start out by talking a little bit about chapters 7 through 10's storyline and characters. And then after that, I'll hand over to Hannah, who will talk to you a bit about the Civ, the culture, history and mythology associated with those chapters. Then Will take you through the language, what's happening in 7 to 10, before Tony does a little update on some of the stuff that's new in the technology, so in the digital learning, that's not really particularly rated 7 to 10, but just to give you an update about what's been happening there more recently. So I'm aware that some of you may even have taught chapters 7 to 10 already a while ago. Others may have not yet gotten anywhere near chapter 7. Some people here might not have even started teaching with Suburani at all. So we're going to come at this all from different backgrounds. So some of what we'll talk about might imagine that you've read chapters 1 through 6, and if you haven't, then that's fine. And we just also wanted to flag that we're doing these chapters now because we thought they'd be quite interesting to look at together, because they form, you know, a narrative together, 7 through 10, that's set in a totally different place to chapters 1 to 6, that introduces a load of new characters, and that takes a bit of a jump when it comes to the language, and that introduces a whole bunch of new Civ. And we chose to start at chapter 7 because we were looking at some of the data about where all of the teachers who are currently using the course might be up to with their students, and there's a huge variety in where everybody's up to. And if you're at chapter 4, you're definitely not alone, and if you're in chapter 12, there are people who are there. So don't feel like, oh, we're doing chapter 7 because that's where most people are. It's where some people are, and it's where we can see some people are coming up to. So we thought we'd prepare you a little bit if you're going to be coming to chapters 7 to 10, or if you're in them already. But those of you who've already taught these chapters or are teaching them at the moment, if you've got any ideas to share about things that are working well with your classroom, or things that you're finding difficult, or things you have questions about, then feel free to share them with all of us at any point. Right, so I'll talk you through the characters and the storyline. So while chapters 1 through 6 have been set in Rome and have followed largely a relatively limited cast of characters that we see again and again, so Sabina's family, Lucilius, the slaves that are associated with Faustus and Rufina's household, we're now going to be looking at a storyline that is an inset story, as it were. It's telling us a flashback from a few years ago that is told by a few characters to the rest of our characters. So it's going to involve a whole load of new people in a different location. And it's going to be told by by Katya and Gisco and a new guy called Indus to the people who are present in the Popina with them, which is Faustus and Rufina and Sabina at some points. And this is something that is kind of helpful to remember as you teach chapters 7 through 10, because you might get quite immersed in the storyline in Britain, but it's helpful. We try to flag it at various points in the stories as well, to just remember that these are stories that are being told. So why did the people who are telling them choose to tell them in this particular way? There might be some bias associated with them, or some uncertainty. Some of the things the characters tell us about are just their own experience, and we can ask ourselves, oh, how might other people have perceived this same event? So that's kind of a helpful thing to remember, and bear in mind as well, who are the audience and what kind of story will they be interested in? So those of you who do some teaching on the Odyssey might feel this is a familiar kind of framework to work in, and remember, who's the narrator and who's the audience, and can that help us get some different things out of these stories? And that's true for chapter 7 through 10. Rufina does have 2 legs. I promise this is not like a spoiler. It's not like she's going to lose a leg in chapter 6. Sorry. I think that illustration comes from a place where that leg doesn't show. So all of this storyline is started off by the fact that Gisco runs into an old friend of his in Rome called Indus. And he sees him in the Forum Boarium, and both these guys are completely surprised to see each other and absolutely overjoyed because they recognize each other, and they used to be soldiers together in the Roman army stationed in Britain. And Indus is a person for whom we have a little bit of archaeological evidence. He's one of our characters who we've based on some piece of, in this case, epigraphic evidence. And his tombstone is here on the left, and actually it's probably a bit hard to read, but it says Indus, who was a member of the core, or the cohort. He was one of the guards of the emperor, Nero, and he's one of the Batavian guards. So Batavia is the region that is modern day the Netherlands, a bit of Belgium and a bit of Germany, I think. And that's where he's originally from. And by the time that he ends up dying and having a tombstone put up, he's living in Rome, and he is a bodyguard to the emperor. But we're imagining that before he took up that role, he might have been one of the soldiers of a Batavian auxiliar cohort that was present in Roman Britain. So both Gisco and Indus, by the time of our stories in 64 AD, have left the army. Gisco has married and has retired from the army, and Indus as well has moved on, although we don't quite know why yet. So the future stories will tell us that he's gone on to take up this role as a bodyguard to Nero, but Gisco doesn't know that at this point. So that means that both of them are kind of an age where they've done quite a long military service. Imagining that both of them might have completed a 25-year, which is a fairly standard length of service in the Roman army. And so if they started quite young, well, the youngest we think they could have joined was probably 17, but if they started anywhere around that age, then they would now be in their 40s, having done a 25-year service. And Indus is a character that offers us some ways into looking at the different people that made up the Roman army, and that are maybe a little bit different from what we might originally conceive of. So the Roman army isn't full of Romans, or it is, but it depends on what you mean a Roman. And then it's not full of people from the city of Rome or even from Italy. A large part of the Roman military forces are made up by these auxilia, these cohorts that are attached to legions, but that are made up of soldiers who are recruited from across the empire, from provinces largely where there is no citizenship yet. And a man like Indus, when he joined the Roman army, would be promised that after he finishes his contract, his terms of service, he will be given not only a pension, but also a military diploma awarding him Roman citizenship and allowing him to pass that on to his descendants, who would then be full Roman citizens with all of the right privileges that entails. So the army is made up of these people who are joining it, perhaps because they think that there's going to be a future for them that they couldn't have had in the place for some reason. And across these chapters, there will be points at which the students will be invited to think about why might it be that the army was an appealing option for a guy like Indus? Why might people join? Is it because they want to learn a trade? Is it because they want a steady income? Is it because they love the idea of fighting, or they love the idea of seeing the world? And all of these different things play into the decisions that men made to be soldiers. Or is it just from pure necessity? They had no other options in their life to sign up. And so across these chapters, we'll look at who made up the Roman army and what might their lives have been like from a slightly different angle. So Indus features heavily, and we're going to find out a bit more about his friendship with Gisco and all the things that they have done for each other, and that friendship will continue across book 1 and book 2, and be quite an important role, have quite an important role in those narratives. But we're also going to find out a lot more about our most important British character, Katya. So Katya is going to tell us quite a lot about her life before she met Gisco and from when she met Gisco, and we're going to find out where she's from. So as you can see from the image here, Katya's family are sword makers, we've imagined. So her father is in the left, and he's making a sword with the hot iron there. And her mother is the lady on the right, who is delicately engraving a sword. And the kinds of sword they're creating here are a typical Celtic sword. And the image there in the middle is an actual Iron Age Celtic sword that you can still see today, which is just shows, I don't know, you can probably not see it that well, but there's lovely intricate carvings and reliefs on the top of it there. And these swords, we think, were probably exported. They were quite high price items. So Katya's family are quite skilled craftspeople to create these swords. And they're a typical kind of export product of the of Britain at the time that we're writing our stories in. So mineral resources in Britain are very plentiful. And so these beautifully made iron artifacts, including swords, but also jewellery and other things were exported from there to the Roman world, both before the Roman occupation, we should say, and continuing to do so. And Katya's family are living in Londinium, which is a very new settlement at this time, it's modern day London, on the banks of the River Thames. So you can see in the photo there that at this time, we think there was a bridge that connected the north and the south side of the river. And on the north side of the river is the start of this Roman town that we know follows a rough grid pattern and starts to have very recognizably Roman features, more so later on than it does at the time of our stories. And Katya and her family, we imagine, live on the south side of the river, where we have some evidence for smaller settlements that were there, and that may probably have been a place where there were more longer standing British settlements that had already been there previously. So for Katya's family, the fact that there is a bustling town growing very rapidly here in Londinium, with trade coming up the River Thames, with ships going from there across to Gaul and from there connected on to the rest of the Roman Empire, is a great thing for their business. There are soldiers stationed there who might buy their swords, and there are merchants coming in who might buy and export. So you can see that for Katya's family, trade under Roman occupation is going, presumably, we think, very well. And we've got Katya on her left there together with her sister Alkisa, and the names of Katya and Alkisa and other British characters that we'll see later on, Lucas, they're all based on Roman inscriptions from Britain at this time that we think are British sounding names. Although we don't actually have any evidence of a girl who was the daughter of a sword maker from London at this time. But Katya is a name that is attested from this era for British women. And we're going to meet another British character in chapter 8 called Lucas. And Lucas, he's at the bottom left here, is another Briton, but he's not from Londinium. He's from Kamla Dunham originally, which is modern Colchester. And we meet him in a rather unfortunate way. You can see Katya punching him in the face up there, because he has managed to steal a sword from Katya's family's workshop. But he wasn't alone in creeping in the night or anything like that. It's that he's a friend of, maybe potentially a boyfriend of, or maybe a boyfriend to be, of Katya's sister Alkisa. And Alkisa has this longer standing association with him and showed him round her family's workshop, we imagine. And he took a sword, and she didn't really want him to, but she wasn't able to stop him, and he did, and he ran off with it. And Katya manages to find him and bring him back to her parents so that he can explain why he did that. And Lucas then tells us the story of why he said he needed a sword. And he relates that he's from Kamla Dunham, and this area of Britain was earmarked by the emperor as a place where Roman veterans would be given some land. And this was a great thing. Another boon of being a Roman soldier is that once you completed your term of service, you might be given not just a pension, but you might be given some land, particularly in areas that have been recently brought under Roman rule. And that's a way for Roman soldiers to spread across the empire. And we know that there are lots and lots of veterans living all over the empire in places that they might have previously been stationed as soldiers. But of course, land wasn't just freely available for grabs. People used to live there, and particularly good land, farming land, was probably farmed before by farmers that were from that region. And Lucas is one of those farmers. So his family used to have a piece of land near Colchester that a Roman veteran came and claimed. And Lucas's brother didn't particularly took issue with this, and fought the veteran who arrived to take their land and got killed in that conflict. So Lucas tells us that his father needs a sword because they want to kill the Roman veteran that stole their land and that killed his brother. And also, Lucas has a very dim view of what the Roman occupation means for him. He says, they come to oppress us, they've come to kill us, they've come to take our livelihood, and we should all rise up against them because they are foreign invaders and they don't treat us in a way that we should stand for. Which is quite an opposite viewpoint to what we might have seen from Katya's family, who have not, as far as we know, suffered really at all negatively from Roman presence in Britain. And Katya's father, when he hears this story, replies in a sort of considered way that, well, you may not like it, but that's how things are. And you're better off, like us, trading with people and making the best of your situation than trying to fight a battle you won't win. What he says. So through Lucas and through Katya's family, we're seeing two very different viewpoints on what it might be like for people to live under Roman rule. And in Britain, that rule isn't very long standing yet, and it isn't very well established. So those of you moving on already towards the later chapters that are looking at Arles, Roman France, Arelate, that's a province that has been under Roman rule for a very, very long time. By the time of our stories, there's no people there that are feeling oppressed by the Romans. That happened a long, long time ago in the lives of the people who live there now. Whereas in Britain, that stability of political stability isn't there yet, and we'll see in the coming chapters how that's going to play out. Because Lucas isn't the only one who feels incredibly angry about their situation. More famously, this is the time at which Badica is rising up against Roman rule. For those of you who don't know the full story of Badica, she's a British queen whose husband died and her country's got left to the Romans rather than passing on to her. And well, there's a longer story behind it, but suffice it to say, she decides she's not standing for the way that her people are being oppressed by the Romans, and she decides to take action and to rebel against Roman rule. And she gets followed by a huge number of people, starting with her own tribe, because we're talking about a time that Britain is still divided into all these different tribes, which Hannah will talk more about, and then increasingly getting traction among lots of other people. And she is a very real threat to the Roman occupation of this province in this chapter. So Badica starts a rebellion and marches first of all on the city of Kamla Dunham, which she destroys with her forces, and then moves on to the city of London. Now this is where Katya's family live. And it's in London that she attacks the city, and Katya's family are caught in the middle of this conflict. The Romans decide to leave the city because they don't feel able to defend it. And so it's completely left defenseless, and Boudica completely razes it to the ground. And this is one of the reasons we haven't got that much archaeological evidence for what Roman London looked like in the year 60 AD. It's because it got completely destroyed and burnt down. And this is an interesting point as well to raise with your students, that Boudica is rebelling against Roman rule, but the people who get killed in a conflict of that are not just Roman soldiers. In fact, the city of London gets destroyed and a lot of British people live there, and all of them were left defenseless and were killed indiscriminately by what we might consider their own country people. And Katya's family are ones who are caught in between this conflict. Her parents and Aukisa are in the city, and Aukisa, who should have returned home when she realized the city was being attacked, stayed because she says she wanted to see Boudica. And she tries to tell us something about how Lucas, maybe she wanted to see him, or maybe he told her to go there. She thought he might be with her forces. But she's lost, and her Katya and Gisco finally do manage to find her in the middle of the burning city. But she can't talk to them fully and explain why she was there, because she's been wounded by, I think a sword, and dies in London. And Katya's parents as well, who were looking for Aukisa all through the city in the middle of the fire that was going on, don't make it out of London. Katya does, together with Gisco and with Indus, and they flee from Rome, and they manage to join back up with the Roman army. And the Roman army after this has regrouped and end up fighting Boudica in a big battle, in which Gisco and Indus also fight. And it is in that battle that Gisco happens to come face to face with Lucas. And he kind of feels sorry for this young man. You know, he was an idealist and he was dealt a rough hand by fate. But when he sees the sword in Lucas's hand, the sword that he'd stolen from Katya's family, that sword that sort of represented the whole storyline of Lucas perhaps taking Yaukisa, the fact that it was her infatuation with him or her friendship with him that made her go into the city and that made her stay when she shouldn't have done, that made her parents stay to look for her, and that brought about the death of Yaukisa and her parents and this enormous grief, obviously, to Katya. It's when he sees that sword that he's seized by anger in a moment reminiscent slightly, perhaps, of Aeneas and Turnus, and decides to kill him, which is illustrated in the bottom right there. So after this story of a great deal of horror and death and military fighting, we move on to chapter 10, which takes a slightly different look at Roman occupation. So whereas in the previous chapters we've seen what happens when the Romans assert their dominance in a military way, chapter 10 starts out with the first story being called Pax Romana, and it looks at Roman rule as it being asserted in a different way. This is more like the soft power. And we move to Aquae Sulis, modern day Roman Bath, where sadly at this point there are no baths yet built, but they are in the middle of constructing them. And so in Roman Bath, Gisco and Indus get stationed as part of a force that oversees the building of a new temple there, and of a temple complex in the sacred spring. And in this image here, you can see the kinds of things that Gisco and Indus are up to: engineering, building infrastructure, overseeing laborers. A lot of the laborers who built the structures in Bath were war prisoners from the conflict with Badica. And Gisco and Indus spend a few years here, I think 2 years, in which they work in this city. And they meet a guy who's illustrated on the left as well, called Antigonus. And he is a Roman veteran who also was one of the people who've been involved, one of the soldiers who've been involved in Claudius' invasion of Britain 20 years previously. And he's now one of these settled veterans that lives in the city of Bath as a Roman soldier living in a province. And he is, again, one of the people for whom we have a bit of archaeological evidence. And this has come from the museum in Bath, the Roman Baths Museum there. And they have a beautiful resource where they've taken a load of inscriptions that are found in the city and written stories about who these characters might have been. So they've imagined backstories for a lot of different people that they have a little bit of evidence for. And one of those people is Antigonus, who is one of these veterans. Now, actually, we were just looking at this earlier and saying this guy, when he died, was actually only 45. So this hardly old, but it does go to show that in order to become a veteran, in order to complete your military service, you weren't in your 60s by any means. So a person like this would have had quite a long life after that, normally, where they are settled and where they have, like Gisco does, the opportunity to maybe marry and have a family, or Indus is moving on to a whole second career. So being a Roman soldier can be a career decision where you spend a very, very long time in the army, or it can be a sort of thing you do for 20 or 25 years, or sometimes even 15 years, before men would move on to something else. And they've had the benefits of maybe a training. Some of them would have become things like cobblers or coopers, because the Roman army didn't just need soldiers, it also trained people up to do a variety of different trades, and these people could set up as craftspeople after their service. So Antigonus is a good person who shows us an example of this kind of experience of a Roman soldier. And it is in Bath that Katya and Gisco live for 2 years together. But the story of Lucas is not fully at an end after his death, because Katya sees an old man who is standing at the sacred spring in Bath, and he's cursing someone. And the curse tablet that he throws in, that she happened to see, is on the bottom right there. And it says that he curses the Numidian cavalry officer, which is what Gisco is, because he killed his son. And later in the chapter, in the night, this guy is going to sneak into where Katya and Gisco live and try to kill Gisco. And he finds Katya first, and in this image he's got a dagger to her throat. But she gets saved, thankfully, and so does Gisco, by the timely presence of Indus, who presumably keeps a very close eye on his friend's sleeping quarters, even at night, and is such a loyal friend that he manages to save their life by being nearby. And that sort of ends up rounding up the storyline of this guy Lucas, and we can imagine what brought this man trying to kill this individual cavalryman, and do we think he's managed to get his revenge on the veteran that killed his other son? He's lost both his sons to the conflict with the Romans, and he ends up ending his own life, he's having his own life ended in that same conflict in this way as well. So there's a lot going on here through the characters to getting towards what was it like to be a soldier, and how might that be different for someone like Gisco and Indus to someone who, like, imagine, for instance, Indus, he comes from a region that's only relatively recently become part of the Roman Empire as well, Batavia. What's it like for him to go and fight against people like Boudica? Is it just an occupation, or would this have brought about a moral conflict? To what extent is this personal? To what extent is this, you know, killing becomes something that you just do in the heat of battle? Do we think that Gisco was in his rights to kill Lucas? Would he have been in his rights, within his rights to do so if it wasn't in the context of the battle against Boudica? And what has Roman rule meant for Katya, and what has Roman rule meant for Lucas's father? And through these characters, a lot of these complex ideas about colonialism and about the dominance of the Romans at the edge of the empire are explored. So that's a little introduction to these stories. I really struggled not to want to tell you the full story because they're so intertwined. And if you think about this for a moment, it's because we thought quite strongly when we were writing these stories, they have to be the kinds of stories that were so important to Gisco and to Katya, to Indus, that they would recount them and they would tell them to their friends when they were sitting down in Rome. So there's quite a lot going on in these stories, because they are not so much a snapshot of daily life, because that's not the kind of story you would tell to your friends. They are really stories that are fundamental to how Gisco and Katya met and how their life took shape, and what Gisco and Indus's experience was like in Roman Britain. So there is quite a lot of plot in these stories, and I think it's quite worthwhile to make sure you spend time on reading each story, because missing one out will probably set you up for confusion later on. If you don't read it in Latin, you can do it in another way, but as a teacher I think it's more important in these chapters to really know what happens in each of them quite carefully, and to keeping track of these characters as they come up. The storyline of Lucas, the background with his father being the one who needs the sword, becomes really important 2 chapters later on, when it is his father that comes and tries to kill Gisco. So keeping track of these characters and keeping track of the narrative will be quite important to sustaining the interest in these chapters. But hopefully, because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of backstory and interesting movement of the plot, that will also be the thing that gets your students engaged and that takes them through these chapters wanting to know what happens next. Right, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's going to talk to you about the sieve for these chapters. Whoops, and Hannah, I'll hand control to you.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the civilization and the locations of these chapters. So coming after the first 6 chapters that are set in Rome, this is an opportunity to kind of look at another part of the Roman Empire and think about life in a province. So the, so the civilization topics of chapters 7 to 10 kind of form a unit and explore the idea of Roman imperialism and provincial governance from various angles. So it's all in the setting of Britannia, this recently conquered province, which is still being established. So chapter 7 introduces this topic of imperialism and Roman governance with the case study of Londinium, which was a brand new Roman town. And chapters 8 and 9 look more broadly at Britannia, at both the life before the Roman invasion and also in more depth at the impact of the conquest on the people living there, and particularly at the tough and the aggressive policies that the Romans used. And then in chapter 10, we move to Aquae Sulis, and we see the aftermath of the Boudican revolt, and then the softer approach from the Romans. So throughout the whole topic, we should be thinking of Britannia in particular, but also how these tactics of expansion and imperialism were used throughout the empire. So it's a really good foundation for when we visit the other provinces in the coming chapters in the books. And we encourage the students to look at these topics from both sides. So thinking about the Roman policies and the lives of our characters, so the soldiers like Gisco and Indus, but also from the point of view of the locals. So in a practical sense, when we think about the Roman expansion, so the Romans invading and they're landing somewhere in the southeast and taking territory from there. So we can see why the site of Londinium would be such an important tactical location in terms of kind of three main reasons. So it was a place where the Thames could be crossed, so it gave them access to the north and the west of Britain. And it was also good for trade because the ships could sail up the Thames. And they also found there kind of strategic hills and fresh water and timber, so they had everything they needed. So it was a perfect location for establishing a new town. And there was very fast expansion between its first founding, so sometime after the Roman arrival, until it was rebuilt in a Roman style in about 60 AD. And as Zala said, there was those settlements on the north and the south banks. And even after the rebuilding, there was a mix of the Roman and the British styles of building, often using local materials. And we see Katya and her family living on the south bank on the outskirts of this new town, but in a traditional round hut. So this is something we can immediately draw about the impact of the conquest and how Roman arrival changed life for the local population, because they're now seeing this kind of growing urbanization around the Roman towns and the camps, and the people are living in much more diverse communities. And we know that there was already trade between the Iron Age tribes and other Roman provinces nearby, so like the swords that Katya's family are making. But the Romans built the network of roads and introduced
I wish.
Which made it easier for goods to travel around Britannia. And Londinium was the distribution centre for all these goods coming in and out. So Londinium attracted lots of traders and merchants and was this kind of hub of commercial activity. And what's fantastic about the site of Londinium is the evidence that we have. So particularly important are the Bloomberg Tablets. So we have over 400 of them written on very thin pieces of wood from about AD 50 to AD 80. And they were never intended to be preserved. So lots of them are just kind of mundane little notes, but they give us lots of information about the people of Londinium and the trades. So this tablet here mentions Junius, who was a cooper, so a guy who made barrels. And the tablets themselves, even without the text, are evidence of this kind of trade because the wood was reused from wine barrels that were imported. And we see a similar sort of recycling of the materials with the glass beads that you can see on the left. So these are found in Gresham Street, so just north of the river. And they're in an Iron Age design, but were made from recycled Roman glass vessels. And the leather shoes too are an example of this kind of sharing of skills and materials. So before, the Britons processed animal skins and made hides, but the Romans brought with them the technique of tanning, which makes the leather much more durable. And it's a material that was used a lot in the army for shoes and for tents, but it became very popular among civilians too. And it's a similar story when we look at the food of Britannia. So although generally the locals would have eaten locally produced food and probably their diet wouldn't change that much, but new ingredients were kind of introduced along this new road network, and there's evidence that these imported foods were available to the soldiers as far north as Vindolanda, although a bit later in the time. So all these objects give us an insight into this diverse makeup of Londinium, and it's really quite a positive view of this new province of Britannia. So this increased trade, the new opportunities, and this is all centered around this new town of Londinium. But next we zoom out a bit to look at the province as a whole, and at Britain before the arrival of the Romans. So by now the students have a bit of an understanding of Britain before the Romans. So from the storyline and from the metalworking and the trading, which were going on before the conquest. And looking at the map, what's really key is that there were different tribes living on this island. So there wasn't a single homogeneous Britain or a single British people. I mean, we can also trace the lines of the Roman expansion coming up from the southeast coast and the new road network that was being built. So we can start to think about this Roman expansion, and as it's spreading west and north, it's encountering all these different British tribes. And Kamla Dunham, which is just on the east coast of the map, serves as a case study for investigating this relationship between the Romans and the places and the peoples that they conquered. So it's in contrast to Londinium, which was a new Roman town. So when the Romans attacked, they targeted Kamla Dunham, which had been important before their arrival. And it was there that they established victory of the southeast of England. So originally it had been an army camp, and this developed into a town. When the Legion left, it became a colony. So Roman veterans, as Lila was saying, their families were given land and granted Roman citizenship. And as we hear from the story from Lucas, the local population was driven out. So on the key on the map, it says it was a settlement that developed into a Roman town, but this was not an organic transformation. So Kamla Dunham became this symbol of Roman rule, and the Arch of Claudius and the Roman-style buildings were this really strong sign of Roman dominance. And the quote here from Tacitus and the tombstone on the right, which shows a soldier trampling an enemy, they give an idea about the attitudes towards the locals. So it's a very different story to that of Londinium. So here the Romans came in force and they drove the locals out violently, and they established their own very Roman settlement. And if we're thinking about this kind of Roman policy of taking control and showing dominance, it's a very similar narrative with the Druids who were persecuted. So the Romans, they came in, they take the land, they build the Roman buildings, and they impose their ideas, and they get rid of really what they see of as a threat. And so looking back at that first story in chapter 7, when Faustus and Indus are discussing Britannia, the stories of the Druids and the human sacrifice kind of all comes together with this kind of Roman propaganda and messaging, which comes out really well in the story of the Druids. And we hear from Faustus with the mythical monsters and the werewolves in the forest. And if you have time, it's great to look at Caesar's own account and question this narrative, but also think about the motive behind this messaging. And it also links really well with the myth in this chapter, which is the Amazons, which talks about the idea of myth and reality and how these stories develop. So with this wider knowledge of Britain, we can think about the different responses to the Roman conquest. So we chose 3 leaders of the British tribes to show different opinions. So the evidence from Londinium might offer some ideas of the advantages. So you've got increased trade, access to these imported goods, as well as infrastructure, so kind of the buildings, the roads. And for sure, this is what the Romans would say. They're bringing civilization, they're bringing a better quality of life, literacy and urbanization. But then obviously you can balance this with this loss of autonomy and their way of life, and also the huge taxation. And importantly, I think we can think about how this would have affected different people differently. So it would have been different for an elite Britain than for an ordinary Britain. So probably education, literacy, new luxury goods, which might have been offered to the tribal leaders, probably wouldn't have reached the local Britons. So like Lucas's family, who were driven out from their lands and lost family members. So all of this is giving a kind of wider exploration of Roman imperialism and the different effects on the conquered peoples. And it's building up to this rebellion of Boudica. And of course, the myth of the Amazons is also very relevant here with Boudica as this fighting queen. So if we think first about the causes of this rebellion, so students will have some ideas from looking at the resist or accept page and from Lucas's family story. But the build up to Boudica's revolt comes out also in the chain of command page in this chapter. So here we give a brief overview of how the power was distributed in the province. And this is a topic we do come back to in book 2 as well and look at in more detail. But here we look at the Roman policies leading up to this uprising, so the heavy taxes, seizing the land, and in particular here the mistreatment of the Iceni tribe. And here Roman imperialism and the governor of Britannia, Decianus, is focused really on profit, so what can be squeezed out of this province. And crushing of the Boudican revolt is really just the climax of this policy of hard power that we have seen. And this resistance is something that happened across the empire. So if we look in the history section, we can see the rebellion of working Getorics. So again, there's more Caesar, if you have some time to read. And I think it's really interesting that these 2 statues, which are modern statues, we still, no matter how much the Romans have given to us, we still celebrate this resistance. And we see back on the chain of command page that after the rebellion of Boudica, Decianus was replaced with Classicanus. So this is really a change in Roman policy in Britannia. So the emperor is warned that if the British tribes continue to be punished and are treated really badly, then there'll just be more unrest and more rebellions. So Classicanus comes in, and we see this different Roman policy, so kind of soft power. And so they're kind of introducing their Roman ways of life and beliefs and assimilating them with the local customs rather than imposing them. And the civilization in this chapter goes a bit further on in the timeline than the stories. So we see Gisco here helping in the construction of the baths, but the civilization content actually talks about the bath and the temple complex in its completed state. And the term Pax Romana, which we see in the first story of chapter 10, is really a reflection of this Roman desire for peace. So we've had the battles and stuff. Obviously, there's not peace everywhere in Britain at this time, but it's this kind of Roman policy that they want peace in the province. And so here they're building the baths and they're fusing the religions. And it's all approached in this kind of context of the Pax Romana. So it's all a response to the failure of the previous policies, which led to Boudica's rebellion. And this fusing of the religions is really well illustrated with the pediment from the temple at Aquae Sulis. And this shows the combination of the British and the Roman imagery and the style. And the construction of the complex and the baths, it wasn't an imperialist act to show dominance, not like at Kamla Dunham. It wasn't ownership of this sacred site, but it was intended as an attempt to win the hearts and minds of the locals. And this religious syncretism can be found across the Roman Empire. And in this chapter, we give some other examples, and it's a topic that we come back to later. So we see the worship of Isis in Rome and Pompeii, and we see Ephesian Artemis in Ephesus. And of course, we can't go to Aquae Sulis and not look at the curses. And I think particularly interesting in this idea of soft power and the Pax Romana, so how the Romans accept the magic of these curse tablets while they had persecuted the Druids who were accused of very similar sort of magic. So the Roman policies weren't always consistent. So I think it's important to think about the motivations behind them. And I think we can easily see that the Druids could have been a threat to Roman power, and these personal votive curses weren't. And in this peaceful setting, we also look at the army in peacetime. And this starts right at the beginning with their involvement in the building of the baths at Rome, at Aquae Sulis, sorry. And we also saw it right at the beginning of chapter 7 when Gisco and Indus are telling Faustus about their duties in Britannia. So this topic fits really well with our characters. And the vicus that grew up around an army camp, so just like that at Aquae Sulis, where Katya is living, would have felt quite similar to what we saw in Londinium as well. And it's this mixing of natives and foreign merchants, Roman officials and soldiers, which was all really important part of maintaining peace in the province. And Vindolanda is a really exceptional example of this, particularly because of the wooden tablets. A bit like the Bloomberg Tablets in Londinium, they weren't intended to be preserved. So they give us this real insight into normal life within the camp and show us this mixing of the military and the civilian peoples. And so we can think about the people who made up the population of this new province of Britannia. And we have this tombstone of Regina, which was found right in the northeast of England, up at the fort of Arbea. And we can see an example of this new diverse community settling in Britain. So her husband, Barates, is from Palmyra in Syria, which you'll get to see a bit more of in book 2. But that's about 2,500 miles from Britain. And this tombstone is dated to quite a bit later than our stories. So I think it's a good chance we can think about how this province of Britannia developed. And it's from here that we leave Britannia and travel back to Rome in the stories with Gisco and Katya. And in the course, we'll go on to many other parts of the empire and see different provinces under Roman rule. So these 4 chapters are a really great foundation for investigating these different policies of Roman imperialism and the responses of the local populations. And we can continue to ask kind of the same questions in the different locations that we visit in the course.
Brill, thanks, thanks, Hannah. I mean, there's a lot going on there, isn't it? It's really interesting. What I would say from a teaching point of view is, it's very, very rich, the 4 chapters. So don't feel that, it's going to, if you can't cover all of that, worry, think to yourself, well, there's a lot you can choose from here. Actually, maybe I'm going to look at this particular theme, or I'm going to look at these couple of themes, or I'm going to focus on this one thing. Very, very rich. If you've got lots of time, fantastic. If you haven't, just pick and choose the bits that you like best, or you think your students will like best. Let's have a little look at the language. So there we go. Chapters 1 to 6, we've looked at the present tense, haven't we? And you can see the various bits and pieces there. Having a flashback, having a story told in chapters 7 to 10 is a perfect opportunity to move from the present tense into the imperfect. I didn't mean to say it was a perfect opportunity. It wasn't meant to be a slight pun. Anyway, it's a great opportunity to move and look at imperfect and perfect tenses. So let's have a look. This is what the chapters do in terms of language. So we start with the imperfect, then we move to the perfect with V and then non-V. So once we've got that constant in, little bit on superlatives. We did originally intend to do the genitive case in chapter 9 and the dative in 11, but as we were writing, we found that we needed the dative more than we needed the genitive, so we just switched them around. So we've got the dative coming in there, we've got adjectives in 10, and then we've got other bits and pieces, as you might expect. If we've got the dative coming in, we got to start to deduce just like necesse, est, decorum est, and if we've got past tense, we're obviously going to start to use postcram and so on. When we did our research on this, teachers said to us, please can we have one chapter on the imperfect and then the next chapter on the perfect. So we tried that and we found that we couldn't do it. And the reason we couldn't do it was we could not write a large number of stories only using the imperfect tense. And not, we were writing these things in the imperfect, and you just think constantly you need to get a perfect in it. And of course, one of the ways in which we explain what the imperfect tense is by contrasting an ongoing action with a single one-off quick action, and vice versa. So they work together rather well. It's not a huge amount there in those 4 chapters. We'll have a little look at it. By the time we finish then with these 4 chapters, the students will have this. So they'll have 3 tenses. They'll have most of the cases, and increasingly complex sentences. So it's not it's not just that the grammar is developing, but the complexity of the sentences themselves. Think about that the sentence is going to get a little longer, a little more complicated. Okay, let's look at the imperfect. I mean, we could talk for, couldn't we, an hour? I could probably talk for an entire day on the imperfect, but I'll pick up 1 or 2 things. It's not for us to say to you how to teach. We've got to put something in the book. Decide for yourself, what do I want to do with the imperfect? Various ways of representing it in English do I want? When we're creating our automatic marking software, we have to decide what would we allow for a translation of a particular sentence. Donna, you're asking where are pronouns? I do not know what you mean. Do you want to, I mean, I know what, do you want to turn your mic on and explain? Where are they presented? Well, I mean, ego and to, nos and wos, we treat as vocab items, I suppose, to start with. If you're talking about the, the various cases of them, then probably the easiest thing is to look in the back of the book, I guess, for that, in the, the grammar at the back. So in terms of the imperfect tense, just decide at the outset, in the book I'll show you, we present it as was, were, and used to, but in this one here, Cortilla nihil dixit sed redebat, Cortilla said nothing, but there is a situation where you might want to represent the imperfect as began to do something. So you don't have to do that. You know, she said nothing, but she was laughing. You can restrict it to that if you want. But just think, do I want to do that with all my students or with just some of them? So decide at the outset what you want to achieve, and the material will be there to allow you to do that. I like to often think when I'm planning my teaching, you know, I don't have the same expectations for every, maybe I should, but I don't, you know, some are going to pick it up more quickly than others. Yeah. You know, some, I think it's going to be great for them to know the term imperfect. For others, just linking was, were, or used to BA, you know, that for some of my students, that's going to be, well, there's no point me saying it's enough. That's going to be all that I am realistically going to get from them, you know. And others, well, they might want to translate things into Latin, and they might want to know, show me all the various different forms of the different conjugations and so on. So again, it's that question of thinking, what do I want to achieve? I have always a bottom line. You know, the minimum is that they should all be able to spot a verb that's got BA in the end of it, and they should be thinking was, were, used to. So that's my minimum that I want to come out at the end of that. That's the language note we give, and you can see within it, I mean, it starts by giving sort of parallel sentences and say, can you spot the difference? So we're encouraging them to look at the Latin and to tell us what's going on. And as I often say with these language notes, hopefully, actually, by the time you get to the language note, you've already done this stuff. You know, so don't feel like you've got to put it off until the language note is in the book. As you go through stories that are introducing these new ideas, just saying, well, can you see anything that's changed here, just to sort of set the ground up. And the way we put it is really to figure out the BA. We've done persons of the verb, haven't we, already in 1 to 6? So they're used to OST mustisant, and of course they're used to M from sum, so it's not a huge step there, MST mustisant. So the way that I teach it myself is I get them to look at the very ending to think about who, get them to look at what I call the tense indicator before that, and then the main sort of head word for the meaning. So I encourage my students to ask 3 questions of every verb: who, what, and when. Okay, so that's, you know, that's what's in the book. Doesn't mean to say that's all we're saying one should teach. It's almost the minimum. We can always go further. Okay, whoops, sorry. So this is our first imperfect verb, imperfect tense verb. And it's at the start when these two characters that we've just heard about bump into each other. I would say one thing to bear in mind is chapters 7 to 10 not necessarily, don't have to be, but they could be all being told this in the bar. It could all be happening in one evening in the bar. You know, if you look back at the De Keller story in chapter 6, that talks about the 5th hour. The Corax and Cortilla story in chapter 6 talks about the 7th hour. You know, there's no reason why these guys couldn't be in the Formboarium around then, and then they go back to the bar afterwards, and there's this story all is told that evening. And then in chapter 10, when Lucrio turns up and says, I've got everything ready, that could be the end of the evening, and then they're out of there. So it's possible that the whole lot is one evening. Anyway, here's our first one. Note, what I really wanted to say is notice the olim there. We're going to be introducing these imperfect tense verbs, sometimes with these, if you like, these sort of things that flag up. It makes it easier for the students to get into the past tenses, and if you like, it makes it harder for them to make a mistake. And I would, as we approach these very simple sentences here, I would try to make sure that the questions that I'm asking, comprehension questions, as I ask my way through these images, that I try to put my comprehension questions in the same tense that I want the students to answer in. So I wouldn't want to answer to ask the question, for example, who does he say they are, or we are? What does he say that we were? Or once when we were in Britannia, what does he say we were? So I'd probably do something like that. And as a slight aside, I quite like to use the term Britannia rather than Britain, so that the kids don't think it's the same place, because, you know, politically, structurally, and so on, a huge amount was different. Okay, we go into then main verbs from the various conjugations with BAs in them, and you can see here we're using to signify that it's going to be the second person singular. We're using ego to just point the kids in the right direction. We'll remove those pronouns fairly rapidly, but when we introduce a new tense, we tend to put the pronouns in just to help the students get the right person to start with. We might say there, what sort of question does ask about what they were up to? Or you could even say, what does he ask they were doing in which province? So you could do some of the work for them and just get them to do the easier parts there. One of the reasons why we do what we do here within, if you like, the storylines, we don't want to get this, we don't want the students thinking that actually Roman soldiers were constantly fighting. So we really want to give the, actually these soldiers were very often doing completely different things. So we very gently introduce, you know, some examples here. Number 6, you can see we've got saipe in there to give the idea of repeated action in the past, and so on. Here, I think, Lila, you mentioned about sort of, or maybe Hannah, different people's perceptions of things. This is a very, very obvious example where Gisco and Katya have completely different memories of how they first met. And is it Casablanca? I forget which film it is, when they were saying, well, you were wearing, maybe that was, they were talking about the Germans were wearing grey. Anyway, here, you know, Gisco remembers it as you were wearing, you know, a green, and no, I was wearing red, and so on. So we, you know, it's not easy to write stories if you're all in the imperfect, but you can see there that's how we've gone about it. And here, number 6, you know, quotidien, every day I used to do this thing. And you'll see if you look through that, maybe it's a geeky, maybe if you look through that story, you'll see that I think we try to make sure that we've used every person, because she's got her sister. He says, well, you two were doing this thing. No, we were doing this other thing. So, okay, can I bring out all the persons? Just in, this is a story here in chapter 7. So even in that same chapter where we introduce it, just think about this verb habitabat here. Ingens aperin silvis prope Londinium habitabat. So you could translate that, couldn't you, as a huge wild boar was living in the woods near Londinium. But that's a situation where you can translate habitabat as lived, because it's still an ongoing action in the past. So, and that's when I said earlier, have a think of what you want to get out of your teaching of the imperfect, and where you want to go with it. Have a think about whether you're going to want to talk to them about translating those imperfects with with in English, if you like, just straight ed perfect tense. Similarly, Britannia apranakane kupieban. You could translate that as the Britons were wanting to kill this boar, or you could, that's one where I think you could fairly translate it as the Britons wanted to. So just to have that in mind, we bring in, I showed you earlier, a quick reminder, we use Nolo and Wallow. They come in chapter 8 in the imperfect. So he was wanting, or she was wanting, or just she wanted. Let's have a quick look at the dative. Here's where it's first introduced. This is chapter 9. Have a look at that sentence at the bottom there, number 1. Verani nuntium vocaverant. It's not accidental that we've got nuntium there, and then in number 2, nuntio here. So when we bring in a new case, we try to give you opportunities to see that word in other cases so that you can compare and contrast that. And again, here in number 3, we've got nuntius. So again, I wouldn't say right from the off, start asking them the case of nuntium in number 1 and nuntius in number 3, but it means that when you come back to it, you can compare and contrast. And similarly in number 4, procuratori can be contrasted later with procuratorem. So it's just, we put a fair bit of effort into making sure that it's possible to compare and contrast, as I say. To start with, we go with what's a sort of fairly standard word order with nominative, dative, accusative, verb. But I think it's fairly easy to overplay or to sort of overstate the idea that that's a standard word order. It's not really, and I think one of the reasons why students might struggle when they get to original Latin or sort of classical Latin is that the word order is often not as they've found it in their school textbooks. So we do, if I can just skip a slide and then come back to it, we do fairly quickly start leading with dative. So to somebody, someone responded. So you'll see quite a lot of what I think of as leading datives with verbs saying and speaking. And we also have, this is what I think of as, if you like, a sort of a possessive dative. There was no hope to the veterans or for the veterans. They had no hope. So we use that form or that structure fairly early on. Okay, just want to go back to this. What we don't do in the textbook notes on the dative is give the chart of all of them. It's there in the back, partly for reasons of space, but partly actually to encourage the students to not have to run through a chart in their minds until they get to the particular place and then think, okay, well then I'm going to go across and read in my mind's eye what case that is, but rather to be thinking, okay, I need to now start to get into my head that A, O, or I can be dative, or you might want to focus on, them thinking of it as 2 or 4, or however you do it. So we give them the nominative and then we give the dative. And of course, if you have them write out a chart, as many of us do, then obviously that's going to be great. And then also notice that we, in that same language note on the dative, we show them or remind them of the ablative, because in the way that we've structured things, they meet the ablative case in chapter 6, and therefore, we can say to them, well, actually, let's have a look at, is there any difference in form in the plural of these two at all? No, there isn't. Fantastic. There is nothing to learn. So don't worry about the dative in the plural, and it's really just in the first declension and the third, we've just got to learn this AE and this I as something, is different. So there's actually, if you think about it in that way, if you already know the ablative forms, there's only 2 forms, if you like, 2 endings to learn. The rest is the same as the ablative. Okay, we've had a look at that very well. I mean, we absolutely could, and I very often have run entire sessions on the adjectives. But what I would say is this, it's entirely up to you. If you are focusing on reading, then there is an argument that you don't need to teach adjectives at all. And that, bear in mind, the kids have had adjectives since, at least chapter 2. can't remember whether we put any in, but they've read adjectives without any problem at all for ages. So if you want, you could just think to yourself, I'm not going to bother teaching adjectives because they don't need to know it. If you're going to get them to write Latin or composing and speaking Latin, okay, well then we might have to do a little bit more work. The course takes the approach of this, really. If you look in that first one of fragorem, we say, look at this noun, right, what do you notice about a case? What do you notice about its number? And what do you notice about its gender? And then in part 2, we say, right, look at this adjective describing this noun. What do you notice about its case? What do you notice about its number? And what do you notice about its gender? Well, they're the same. They're adjectives, they match. So that's the approach we take here. Really light touch, very easy, really. Just saying, look at the noun, case, gender, number, look at the adjective, check it's the same. Right, I mean, you definitely don't want me to talk for hours, so I'm going to move on from that. The last thing I'll say is, with all of the language teaching, a lot of us are going on to read literature with the students. A lot of students aren't going to get to that point, but that doesn't matter. We can still enjoy the beauty of the language beyond the end. As this isn't a bit of Cicero or Caesar or anything. It's just a bit of us, stabbing in the darkness and trying to do something nice occasionally. So just have a look at that. But imagine you were teaching that as some literature. You might see that in this penultimate sentence here, viros, feminas, liberos, so we've got a little bit of tricolon there, and we've got a little bit of a syndeton and so on. So you can bring these things out. Don't feel that you've got to wait until you get to your literature before you start enjoying those things. As I say, a lot of students aren't going to stick around that long, sadly. So let's give them the sort of the benefit of that joy earlier. And also, of course, it will make it easier for them when they do get to the original literature. They won't be so surprised at those things. So you'll see a little bit of that going on. I think, Lila, this was one of yours, wasn't it? That final sentence here. This is a bit sad. I mustn't talk too long, but what I do want to say is this is from the story Heros in chapter 8. And one of the things we wanted to do was show that Roman soldiers were not always, building or attacking Britons. This is a story where a Roman soldier tries to save the life of a young British girl. I think actually the idea is based on, is it The Eagle Has Landed? I forget. Anyway, it's a sort of an old sort of Second World War film where actually some German soldiers are sort of invading Britain, but actually dive in to save a little girl who's fallen into a mill. Anyway, have a look. You've got here, said miles ad nimian gravis, puella non valida, glacies non firmus. So again, you've got some tricolon, you've got some asyndeton, you've got some omission if you have the main verb. You can compare and contrast, which word compares with, which words compare with balance with miles and so on. So plenty to do there. And here, this is the last little bit I've got. This is quite a, it's quite a scene here. This is, again, you mentioned it, Lila, in your section, I think earlier on, where Lucas's dad has sort of broken in and is potentially going to kill Katya. And I mean, there's all sorts of things, haven't we? Subito manus me tenuit, tum pugionem conspexi. And then you've got this sort of, interweaving, tum pugionem conspexi, de pugio cadebat sanguis, custodem romanum iam necavi susaravit vox crudelis. So you've got a little bit of sort of interweaving, but really it was this de pugione cadebat sanguis, that word order there, leaving that sanguis to the end. It's a small thing, but do encourage the students to look at that, think, why has that been delayed? Why are the words in that order? And so on. Okay, that's enough from me. So I think, Tony, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just share my screen and we can move on. So, I mean, as Lila said, the tech goes across all the chapters. This is taken from chapter 8 in Britannia's area, but it's standard how this works. This is a sorting exercise. Can be used for all kinds of things. We use it for words or for civilization topics, so you can put things into right categories. It's just a bit game-like categorizing things. I thought I'd go through it just so that you know, in case your students have any problems. Particularly, I understand that some people find the scoring a bit confusing, but I'll explain it, and actually it's very straightforward. The way this works is you either have 2 or 3 different groups. In this one, we've got I, you, they. We've got a pool of words here, and we're going to put them into the right category and then get it marked automatically by the program. We've got 3 questions here. On each question, you have 3 attempts at getting to the right answer for all the words. But let's go through. The 3 ways you can put a word in a category: you can click the bar here with a name on it. So I'll put the right one here, they, and as you see, it moves down, goes into the they category. The other way you can do it is with the buttons at the bottom, which are color linked and number linked with the title of the category. So the next one, I can use the 2 button. And a good reason for using that is that they remain static at the bottom of the screen, whereas as you see, as words are moved down, these bars move up. So if you've got a number of words all in the same category, you might be thinking click, 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 but by the time you've clicked the first one, it's moved up, and the bar is not where it was before. You have to move your cursor or whatever. The other way you can select which category word goes into is with the number keys on your keyboard if you're using a laptop or something that has a keyboard attached. And that's really quick. You can just rattle through them quite quickly. I can show you, sort of, there I go. I've made some mistakes there. We've got 2 different ways we can move words around. In the pool, if you think, oh, I don't really want to do Wakabas now, I'd like to do Habio, you just click on Habio, it goes to the top, and it's the selected word, which is the one that's going to go into the categories down below. So I'll put that into you. Oh, that's a mistake. I realize that, so I can just click on the word and it goes back into the pool again. So we can just put that in there and that in there. Still not all right, but I'm going to check it anyway. So you get ticks and crosses to indicate which ones you've got right, and then you get offered try again. As I say, you can get 2 more, two try again. You can have 3 goes at it. And so you're back in the same position as you were before, but the words that you got correct are still down the bottom. The words that you haven't got are now in the pool at the top. So I'll quickly go through these and do a check. That's all correct now. As you can see here, the score I've got is 9 out of 15. And it's very simple. 9 is the number of words I've answered correctly, and 15 is the number of goes I've had, the number of attempts I've had to get them in. So if you've got 9 words and you get them all in first go, that's 9 attempts. So your score is 9 out of 9. If you've got 9 words and you get 7 of them in first time, another word you take 2 attempts, and another one you take 3 attempts, your total number of tries is 7 plus 2 plus 3, which is 12. So you'd actually get 9 out of 12, which would be 75%. Anyway, we'll go on to the next question. We'll quickly go through these. 3. Interestingly, here we have, it's I, you, they, but the yous include both singulars and plurals. So we're moving on. We're expecting them to know a bit more closely how the endings work. Try checking that one. Excellent, that's all right. And I just want to show you what happens when we get to the end. You, I, well, let's do some mistakes. again. We'll get some wrong as well. So this is a time when I've had 3 goes at this question, 3 attempts. I still haven't got them all right. And it actually says, okay, enough of that. Let's move on. I'll show you what the answers are. That's where they ought to have gone. And then you can go on. We've finished our 3 questions, and we then see the results here. Again, as I say, I've got 24 out of 40. If we were to count through there, we've got 24 right answers. In fact, we've got 3 here. We didn't get a right answer at all. So we've got 24, that's 3 lots of 9 minus 3. And we took 40 attempts. So if you actually add up all the ticks, that's the number of words you got right. If you add up all the ticks and the crosses together, that's the number of attempts you had. So the total you get is the number of words you got right out of the number of attempts, and gives you your score, and that's done as a percentage as well. Now we've got a couple of buttons at the top we haven't used yet. Help tells you just what I've told you about how the scoring works in detail, and how to play goes through in detail how to play the game. The other button we've got here is My Sorting, and this is a way you can get access to all the exercises you've done in this sorting category. So you click on that, and I've got a few here, so I can click, and I get this information about exactly how I did. You see all the words in the right category, and the number of ticks and crosses show how long it took there. So you can see at a glance which words you had a problem with and which ones you didn't. We can look at any of them like that. All this information is stored back on the Hands Up server. And what is useful is that your teacher, or you as a teacher, can see your students' information. So this is my little class. These people are all pretty keen on tennis actually, but they're not too bad at Latin. Rob particularly, he's very gritty, and he gets down there. We can order these by clicking on the top bar, so we can see who got the best mark in the first exercise, who got the best or the worst in the third exercise, and so on. With three students, it doesn't, it's not really very necessary, but if you've got 30, it's quite useful somehow to get some ranking there. And over time, you'll find there are quite a lot of exercises, so you'll be having to scroll along, and then we're going to have a way that you can see the most recent first or the most recent last, different ways of looking at the data. So we've similarly got the same kind of stuff for autograded marking. I'm not going to go into this in detail. I know we've gone quite a lot over the hour that we've proposed for this exercise, for this talk. But this is a very small class with a couple of budding actors. And we can see how they did in their automatically marked translations. Do encourage you to get your students to use that. It's very, very handy. And then you can come in and see exactly where they're having problems. At the moment, you have to look at each one. In time, we hope to have, or we will have, ways of pulling out for a class which sentences and which constructions pose the most problem for you, or for your students. So I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to run quickly through. It's mainly for the sorting and for the auto grading of translations and for the vocab tester. You can get a class view of how your students are doing on all of those. But any questions, do ask.
Great, thanks Tony. Sorry everyone that we've gone on, as we often do, a little longer. There's been some questions in the chat. One that I don't know, the very first one, actually. Carolyn, you asked, did whole families work together in an occupation, and did the women play a significant part? This is when we're looking at Iron Age, early Britain. I don't know what evidence we have of that. I don't know if Hannah and Lala, you can remember what we found when we were working on that. It's, evidence for that sort of thing is really hard to come by. I think we were partly driven by what one can see of the way in which women have a very different role, had a very different role in Iron Age Britain. It didn't seem to be anything to us that suggested that couldn't be possible. I think my recollection was that we were sort of putting these guys in a little settlement the other side of the river, actually, from where Londinium built up, and they were sort of there servicing this Roman trade centre. So it felt quite natural to us. I mean, obviously there are Iron Age burials in Britain where it seems that women were were powerful members of the community. So I think we felt that, we didn't want to have, well, here's the man hammering away and here's the woman doing the washing up. We wanted to show that these women were very capable, were able to, to work together in that families. But I don't know whether, Hannah, Lana, you can think of anything else. It didn't seem to bother us when we did it.
No, I think it just in terms of that family setting, if they're living in that kind of round hut and everything's going on in that same place. So I think we thought it was very believable that they would all kind of work together on the family business.
And I guess what was meant by a family at that point also is, is a question that could be explored, because how people lived and worked together, probably quite flexible. Have we got questions? I know not everything's come up in the chat, so were there questions or no questions?
I see there's one from Darcy here about the vocab and the date being saved automatically. And yeah, for the vocab tester at the moment, the student has to press save. But I'm thinking we need to have a way where we have checkpoints. Maybe they do 20 questions and then there'll be a little breather while they say, you say how they've done on that. And at that point, the data would be saved automatically. Initially, I did want to have automatic saving. If you just close down the browser willy-nilly, it would remember, it would do the saving there. And that was great on about 60% of browsers and platforms. So it's not good enough, it needs to work everywhere. And so we went back to having an explicit save button. But really, I can see that is a problem. People forget. There is a little prompt comes up, but then people think, oh, I think I've done it, or they forget. And so I think it'd be much better if we have a checkpoint, it's done automatically. And then, so, and yeah, as someone pointed out, that's how it's done for the autograde translations and for the sorting, because that's got a discrete sort of endpoint. So if that helps.
Nick, you've put, it would be great to have things other than sorting and auto grading of translations. Yeah, for sure. So some things that we've got in the to-do list, and I always feel slightly worried because we're often saying we're going to do this thing and there's no use to you until we've done it. But for example, you know that when the students are reading, they click and it will parse everything for them if they want it to, or you want them to click that thing. So what you can deduce from that is that we have the entire course parsed, and what that means is automatically we can say, right, for any story, turn it into a find 5 examples of. So for example, we could take any story or every story and say, right, find 5 examples, or click on the story, 5 examples of the imperfect tense, or click on 3 perfects, or click on to datives of the third declension, for example. So we'll be able to, when we get a minute, when we finish with book 2, we'll be able to generate a stack of that sort of thing. We've also got it in mind to do activities where the students get an English sentence and they then have the Latin sentence without the endings, and then it could be multi-choice. We could give them, a little drop down of a few endings. They choose the right one, or we could set it up as, or we could set it up as type in, so they could have to type in the endings. Years ago, we built a sort of word bricks activity where, and that's more for sort of original Latin, they have to sort of try to get the words into more of a Latin word order. So they get an English sentence, it might be a translation of a bit of Virgil or whatever it might be, or Catullus, and they have to sort of put things into the right order. So that'll be for sort of more advanced students. I can't think, Tony, if you, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything else, but we've got...
Yeah, we've got the Catena game, which is a kind of, a bit like a word search where you look for forms in a grid. That's more game-like, but again, it sort of gets you thinking about what constitutes a word. We've also got a game that Lila and Hannah wrote about, what was it called? A repo, yes. But it's effectively like Othello, is it? Is that what it used to be called? No. No. Anyway, it's another word, more game-like sort of thing. But it's, again, it's just manipulating letters and recognizing stuff. And anything that gets thinking in Latin is going to be helpful.
I've just, sorry, Julia, I sent it to you accidentally as a direct message. I've just put in the chat a link to a page on our website where there are a couple of games. That one, a repo that we were just talking about, and sort of Catena, like a boggle thing. So, yeah. And if you have ideas of things that it would be handy for us to make, then just shout. But what else we got? I would love to have grammar activities in the teacher resources which only use vocab from the learning list. Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Lucy. We should do that. What else have we got? Will this be recorded? Yeah, we will put a recording of the session up on the website, and I think, Hannah, you'll be able to email everybody with a link to where that is. It'll be on the events page.
Yeah, it'll be later today.
I wonder if Diane's question was about, maybe she's here and she can say it herself, but about one of the activities we were thinking of creating. Is that right? Like one of the digital activities, and whether it would record student progress. And I think the answer to that is yes, everything we create for Suburani ultimately will have trackable data that can go into the teacher view.
Cool. Fireworks. Yeah. Okay, cool. Any other queries or questions?
There's a question about some more plans for novellas. So maybe, Lila, do you have an update?
Yes, I think so. I think we're going to write book 2 first. That is very much the priority. So once that's done, that will free us up a lot more to do more projects like this, because it's work does go into it. It does take time, particularly if there's illustration involved as well. So we've parked that for now for the next few months, and we're hoping to pick up work on that in the summer. Also, if anyone else is interested in writing novellas, this is not like a thing that's limited to Hilary or our team or whatever. So if you've got an idea for a story that you think would be nice for other students to read, then do get in touch with us if that's something you're interested in writing yourself. But I think there are more going to be forthcoming in the next few months. Yes.
Just going back to sort of other activities, I think it would be quite, just as we've got a, the vocab trainer that drills the vocab, it would be quite nice to do something. I mean, it's a little bit old school, but it would be quite nice to do something that drills the grammar, drills the terminations a little bit. And I don't imagine that would be particularly tricky, Tony, to build something
No,
like that. Would it really?
For Greek, if anybody
Yeah.
Greek, on the Eton College website, there's some Greek drills for nouns, verbs, adjectives, and vocabulary as well. So we'll be able to translate those quite easily into Latin exercises based on the Suburani learning words and the grammar that we're covering as well. So definitely.
Sorry, Tony, go on.
I was just going to say, definitely we will have more things of that nature as well. And also we hope help with things like scansion of Latin hexameters and so on. It's some more advanced stuff, things to help people with writing Latin sentences from English for those people who want to do it, but doing it in very small steps so people can just get a taste of it and enjoy Latin in all its aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, so you've answered that one. I mean, book 2, I often get asked this from emails. Book 2 is definitely coming out this summer. It has to, because we've got plenty of people who are coming to the end of book 1. So we're expecting that, we think probably late June is my guess in terms of when it will be, a physical version of it will be available. And if you're sort of desperate to, to get a sense of it for your own planning for next year, I think we will be able to make a low-res, slightly redacted version of the first 10 chapters, so that's 17 to 26, in 2 weeks. 2 weeks tomorrow, I think, is our release date. So just drop us an email if you want that, and we'll send you a link. We're okay with that, Hannah, I think, aren't we?
Yeah, I think it said March 15th. Around
yeah,
then.
Yeah, March 15th. And it's done, we're very close to the end of writing it, in fact, but it's then all the sort of the checking and the sort of final proofreading and the conversion for the American spellings and so on that needs to be done. But that's going fairly well. Great. Yeah. So useful things in the chat. I think we've covered all the questions. That question about if you've got a subscription for book 1, you'll get book 2 as part of that, so you don't have to pay again for that. That's just if you've got a subscription for a year, you get everything that we've done. Cool. Great. Sorry that we've gone on. Yeah. Okay. If you do have any questions at any time, feel free to email or set up a chat in Calendly or whatever it is. And we're always here, so just shout. Thanks, by the way, to everybody. Soon, by the way, the other thing to say, soon, if those of you who are interested in book 2, soon we will be putting something up online to allow you to pre-order. We've got no idea how many to print in the first print run, and of course you check it really thoroughly, don't you? And then as soon as it's printed, you start finding mistakes. So we don't want to print more than we need, but we also don't want to not have enough. So bear that in mind if you know that you're going to want some copies of book 2 for the summer. When we do send out that message of pre-ordering, it won't hold you to anything. You can pre-order, and if you decide actually when they are available you don't want them anymore, you don't have to buy them, but it just allows us to ensure that we will definitely have enough. Please don't pre-order 2,000 and then say you don't want them. But okay, anything else? No. Okay, great. Thanks everybody. See you next time.